Rep. Joe Neguse's exchange with FBI Director Kash Patel folded two urgent, connected questions into one. First, why the FBI sometimes struggles to stop violent plots that show up online. And second, how the personal finances of a top law enforcement official affect public trust in the agency that's supposed to protect us.
Thank you, Director Patel, for being here today. I have a couple of questions regarding a terrible shooting that occurred in Colorado, a state, as you may know, that I represent. You've testified previously about, I think, what you would describe as your efforts to provide more information regarding the investigation with respect to the horrific assassination of Mr. Kirk. And so, in that same vein, I'm hoping you can provide this committee and my constituents in Colorado with some clarity.
Absolutely.
I think, as my colleagues know, in Evergreen, Colorado, Jefferson County, a county that I proudly represent, at Evergreen High School, a shooter ultimately injured. 2 students were praying for their swift recovery. There's an article here from Colorado Public Radio. The title is, quote, FBI was already investigating an account that may have been linked to the Evergreen shooter. You're familiar with the circumstances generally, Director, regarding this terrible tragedy.
Yes.
So my understanding from the public reporting is that an organization reported to the FBI in July of this year regarding, just reading here from the article, that the FBI opened an assessment into a social media account user whose identity was unknown and who was discussing the planning of a mass shooting with threats nonspecific in nature. This is the FBI's statement to the press. And that the FBI continued to work this assessment investigation to identify the name and location of the user up until September 10th, 2025, which was the day of the tragedy. Can you provide us some clarity on what were the impediments to finding, the account user, and maybe describe in greater detail the FBI's work in that regard?
Generally speaking, yes, because I know even though the shooter's deceased, the investigation we're not done.
Sure.
And so the impediments to finding these individuals, and you highlight a great point. We had 2 huge tragedies in the span of days in this country. The school shooting in Evergreen, Colorado being one of them. And proactively going out onto these social media platforms, which are so large, is our biggest impediment. And we need to rely on the service providers. There's actual legislation, I can't remember the name of it, that's up for renewal, which will, and I think at the end of the month, which gives service providers the ability to report that information in from their end without liability. We need that to continue, because while the FBI has so many people and the police are great at doing it, there's just too many platforms to cover down on.
Well, I appreciate that, Director Patel, and I think we're certainly, I'm interested in continuing this conversation, because I think the reporting suggests that there's a pattern, and that ultimately, we want to make sure that law enforcement is able to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening in the future. I have a question. It's not meant as a gotcha question, so it just frame it there. But it is in regards to some reporting around a periodic transaction report that you had filed earlier, this year. So this is in July, pursuant to the ethical obligations as a senior executive official. You remember filing that in July?
Yes.
Yeah. So in that report, as best as I can surmise, you disclosed that you divested $100,000 or more in a variety of different stocks, which I presume was pursuant to the ethics agreement that you negotiated with the Department of Justice. In that same report, there's a disclosure regarding purchases of 2 different transactions. So between $15,000 to $50,000 in a national coffee house chain, and between $50,000 to $100,000 in a semiconductor company on May 9th and May 12th. Are those transactions that you're doing personally, or are these through a stockbroker, or are these transactions that you're handling yourself?
So how they happen is I submit proposals under DOJ guidance to say, hey, I would like to trade this or that, and they run their review, and the FBI runs a review, and then they come back and say yes or no, and then I make the transaction.
Is there a reason that you decided to make the purchases into those 2 companies?
Generally speaking, before I got this job, I was, trading stocks, but not a lot, like most people, and I just follow certain industries, and I thought they would be a good investment.
So the reason why I ask, right, because you had divested in other companies, and I presume that wasn't because there were actual conflicts. It's just that you wanted to avoid an appearance of impropriety.
It was both.
Both, but not all of the companies were conflicts.
Whatever they
you
make
divested from.
I don't make the call, they make the call.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess my point would be, the reason why I ask this, why I said it's not a gotcha question, I have for years led an effort here in Congress to try to ban members of Congress, senior executive officials, from trading stocks. And it's bipartisan in nature. We're working really hard to get that done, Republicans and Democrats. And you can understand, I think, given your role, given the nature of the position that you hold as the leader of the largest law enforcement agency in our country, that divesting entirely, not doing day trading now, I think would be something that would be in the interest of the American people. So I just would hope you would consider that, and that moving forward, that perhaps not purchasing stocks in individual companies, I would think would be something that would be worth pursuing.
Gentleman's time is...
Start with the investigation piece. Neguse opened on Evergreen, a small Colorado community traumatized by a school shooting, and the public reporting that the FBI had an assessment open into a social media account that might have been linked to the shooter. That's a familiar, painful scene now. A credible tip or a concerning account shows up, investigators open an assessment, and despite best efforts, the person isn't identified before violence occurs. There are 3 practical reasons this keeps happening. First, the scale problem. There are billions of accounts across dozens of platforms and apps. Human analysts simply can't monitor everything. Second, technical and legal barriers. Many platforms use encryption or privacy defaults, and companies fear legal exposure if they hand over user data unless Congress gives them clear, balanced protections. Third, resource and coordination limits. Federal agents need faster, better tools and closer cooperation with local police, platform trust and safety teams, and public health prevention programs to move from an assessment to a disruption before it's too late. Neguse's questioning made a sensible point. If the FBI's hands are tied by outdated rules or by a lack of statutory safe harbors for platforms to report threats without fear of liability, then closing that legal and technical gap should be a bipartisan priority. It also exposed another truth that TV clips miss. This isn't only a law enforcement problem. It's a whole of community problem. Schools, parents, mental health providers, local police, and federal investigators all have roles. Investing in threat detection technology, training for school staff, and funding community prevention programs will reduce the cadence of these tragedies. And while privacy must be protected, privacy shouldn't be an excuse to leave investigators blind to clear, imminent threats. Then, Neguse moved to ethics, a different but related kind of risk. He asked about the periodic transaction report that showed the FBI director making personal stock purchases, a coffeehouse chain, and a semiconductor company. Director Patel described the DOJ review process he followed. That procedural defense matters. It's important that senior officials disclose and that ethics offices review trades. But disclosure and review aren't the same thing as eliminating conflict or the appearance of conflict. Why does that matter? The FBI's power depends on public confidence that investigations are impartial and not influenced, or perceived to be influenced by personal financial interests. A top official buying or selling individual stocks in the midst of major national security or law enforcement responsibilities raises obvious questions. Could a decision on procurement, enforcement priorities, or litigation affect one's portfolio? Even if the official followed the letter of the ethics rules, the optics are corrosive. That's why Neguse pressed not to embarrass or trap the witness, but to push toward a higher standard. When you run an agency like the FBI, you should either divest from individual holdings or place assets into a blind trust so personal financial incentives can't even be suspected of shaping official actions. The fix here is straightforward and bipartisan. End active individual stock trading by senior executive officials and require full divestment or blind trust arrangements for those with policymaking authority. Congress has built similar rules into the past for narrower categories. It's time to make them broad and binding, and to extend the same standard to senior appointees who exercise enormous discretion over investigations, prosecutions, contracts, and classified matters. That reduces temptation, reduces the need for endless ethics policing, and restores some of the confidence the FBI needs to do its job. Put the two threads together and the point becomes urgent. Preventing violent acts requires a trusted, well-resourced FBI that is technologically equipped and institutionally independent. It also means leaders who set a clear ethical example. You cannot credibly ask communities to trust the FBI's threat assessments if the public worries whether the Bureau's priorities are influenced by politics or personal investments. If you want to act, here are concrete, practical steps to push for now. Insist your representatives support legislation that bars senior federal officials from trading individual stocks or requires robust divestment blind trusts. Ask Congress to pass clear, balanced safe harbor rules so platforms can share credible threat indicators with law enforcement without undue legal risk, paired with strong privacy and abuse safeguards. And demand adequate funding for the FBI's investigative technology, for local prevention programs in schools and communities, and for trauma-informed victim support after attacks occur. Finally, remember the human frame behind the policy. These hearings aren't just procedural theater. They're about kids in a Colorado classroom, families waiting for answers, and a society that needs institutions it can trust. Neguse's questions were about prevention and integrity at once, two things we should all care about, regardless of party. Hold leaders to both standards, protect us from violence, and give us reason to believe the people in charge are acting in the public interest, not private gain. Hold leaders to both standards, protect us from violence, and give us reason to believe the people in charge are acting in the public interest, not private gain.